Um, my name's Peter Whitwell. I'm director and founder of the New Culture Forum. We started in 2006. I'm not going to give you a long spiel, just to say that we're delighted to be involved in this conference along with John and Melissa and the Danube Institute, which is a superb outfit, which I've got to know in recent years. And this is one of the most vital issues facing us. And the point of the next session, really, is that we have a panel of 4 speakers here, and we want to draw on some of the themes that came out of the Lord Alden's speech this morning. Obviously, he gave us an extremely wide survey of the state of things, but we want to sort of look further at the sheer extent of religious persecution now, and the future, possibly, where it's going. But also, in a way, I think the panel and this particular session will speak to the title, which is Invisible Victims. Quite why are these people not being talked about? You know, they have to be talked about before they can be helped, before any action is coming. And frankly, it appears that there is sort of almost no knowledge about it. Your average person in the street walking past here today, I think, would not really even be aware of the level of persecution that there is. That is crucial. So we want, really, from this particular section of today, to ask, you know, where is the media coverage, if you like, of this question? How well informed, if at all, are Western publics about it? And if they are informed, what they think should be done. How do we make people more aware? And for that matter, why are they not aware? So we have 4 great speakers. You have their biographies there in front of you. So for a speed's sake, I will just briefly introduce them. We have Fiona Bruce, who is Conservative Member of Parliament since 2010. We have Professor Stephen Bullivant, who is Professor of Theology and Sociology of Religion at St Mary's University, Twickenham. We have Damien Thompson, who is Editor-in-Chief of the Catholic Herald. And we have Mervyn Thomas, CMG, who's Chief Executive of CSW, which is a Christian human rights advocacy organisation, which he founded some 40 years ago. So I will ask each speaker to come up to talk about the various particular themes that I've just outlined, starting with Fiona Bruce. Thank you very much, Fiona.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be with you today, although it is with some trepidation that I have to follow that tour de force by my parliamentary colleague, Lord Alton. But at least it's also with some relief that you haven't asked me to talk about the B word. One of the specific topics of this conference is Western public attitudes. And so I thought it might be helpful to give you a very short summary of how I perceive the attitudes of UK members of Parliament across the political parties have developed on the issue of religious persecution since I became a Member of Parliament in 2010, almost a decade ago, though it feels like much longer. During this period, we have sadly, as we've already powerfully heard, witnessed an increasing amount of religious persecution across the world, both in its extent and ferocity. Fortunately, over the same period, I have also witnessed increasing engagement by UK members of Parliament on the issue of global religious persecution. Of course, many more parliamentary voices are needed, but I do now notice more interest from MPs to ask questions in the House of Commons, to call debates, than when I first started raising questions about persecution, such as of the Coptic Christians in 2011, or of Christians in Iran in 2012, or even in 2013 when I was able to take part in a debate on human rights violations and religious freedom in Burma, or later that year when I led a debate on the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. I claim little personal credit in this respect, but whilst there were few concerned MPs then, I do believe things have changed, albeit not as much as we would like. Up to that point, I had the impression that the issue of religious freedom was very much a minority one, rather than a mainstream issue in the House of Commons. Indeed, I felt, to be frank, sometimes slightly odd raising some of these issues. But over the years, I have begun to sense that things are changing. How, you may ask? Well, I do at this point want to pay tribute to our previous speaker, Lord Alton, who incidentally has just in the past few days achieved 40 remarkable years serving in the UK Parliament. He has been both a forerunner and a continuing inspiration to countless parliamentarians regarding the championing of religious freedom. And at Lord Alton's suggestion, a cross-party group was set up in about 2012. That's a group of MPs and members of the House of Lords from different political parties. This has been a definite catalyst for change and of increased interest in the UK Parliament. Not the only cause, I'm sure, but it is a significant one. This group is called the All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Freedom of Religion and Belief. One of my colleagues, members of the House of Commons, is here, Ian Paisley, MP for North Antrim, and he is one of the members of that group. It exists to raise awareness of freedom and religion and belief as a human right, to raise its profile amongst parliamentarians and also amongst the media, government and the general public in the UK. It's based in an office in the House of Commons with full-time staff and is now under the enthusiastic leadership of another Northern Irish MP, Jim Shannon. It has acted as a rallying point, an educator, and provided of information for UK parliamentarians. It's provided a number of influential reports, including its first, in 2013, Article 18, An Orphaned Right. It has equipped members of Parliament to call on the UK government to take action, to challenge religious persecution and to promote religious freedom in a number of practical ways, such as by training and equipping Foreign Office staff to do so and by improving their religious literacy. Other country-specific all-party parliamentary groups have also developed over these years to help focus hearts and minds in the UK Parliament on persecution in specific countries such as in Burma, North Korea and Pakistan. And UK parliamentarians travel to countries and raise challenges directly with government representatives there about issues of or threats to religious freedom. I've been privileged to do so in Burma, Nepal and Nigeria. And as we've heard recently, there was the commendable visit to Pakistan by Jim Shannon MP, Lord Alton MP and the Labour MP Marie Rimmer, where they met judges and challenged Asia Bibi's treatment there. Shortly afterwards, she was declared free by some of those same judges. And over the past few years too, the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, which I have the privilege of chairing, has produced several reports relating to religious persecution, or including religious persecution within them, such as our report on human rights in China 2013-16 and our report in 2018 titled Human Rights in Russia Today. And similarly over recent years, trusted NGOs like Christian Solidarity Worldwide, whose Chief Executive Officer Mervyn Thomas is here today, hold several meetings a year in our Parliament buildings, which nowadays can be attended by as many as 50 MPs. I remember when I attended my first such meeting in around 2011 or 2012 with Aid to the Church in Need, and I was the only MP in the room. Debates in the UK Parliament have therefore, over the past 5 years or so, attracted an increasing number of MPs wanting to speak on issues of religious freedom. And such debates are now even sometimes oversubscribed. That is, that too many MPs want to speak in the time available. An extreme example of this was last summer. Ian and I were just recalling this, when so many MPs wanted to speak in a debate on Christians overseas that we were restricted to just 90 seconds each to make our points. Frustrating, but also heartening. Of course, whilst there may be increased interest by backbench members of Parliament on such issues, this has not necessarily translated into UK government action. For example, a debate was held in the House of Commons in 2016 calling on the UK government to take action to hold to account the perpetrators of genocide against Christians, Yazidis and others in Syria and Iraq. At the end of that debate, members of Parliament voted by no less than 278 MPs to none, calling on the UK government to take action and declare the atrocities perpetrated by Daesh against religious minorities as genocide. Our government refused to do so and continues to refuse to do so, citing, as we've heard, its long-standing tradition to leave this question to international judicial systems. And as we've heard, in order to address the UK's persistent failure to determine genocide, a genocide determination bill has been introduced by Lord Orton in the Lords and myself in the Commons. It is disappointing that the UK government, despite these steps, has still failed to respond more constructively on this issue. But I do want to encourage you somewhat. In other ways, our government has recently taken a number of steps with regard to tackling religious persecution. In her 2017 Christmas message, our Prime Minister, Theresa May MP, asked us, and I quote, "to remember those around the world today who have been denied their freedoms, from Christians in some parts of the Middle East to the sickening persecution of the Rohingya Muslims." And she spoke, and I quote again, of the UK government's determination to stand up for the freedom of people of all religions to speak about and practice their religions in peace and safety. In July 2018, the same Prime Minister appointed Lord Ahmad as the government's Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, and his role includes tackling religious discrimination across the world. Of course, it is crucial as his mandate approaches its first year mark that we consider within the UK Parliament whether it is sufficient, whether it needs to be strengthened, ideally to ambassador level, and how it can be better resourced to address this massive task. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office has also now produced a freedom of religion or belief toolkit, a FORB toolkit, for staff serving abroad in country posts, which purpose is to enable them to address actual and potential FORB violations. This step does at least acknowledge that reliable evidence-based monitoring and analysis of FORB violations is essential if we are to develop effective policies to address it. And just 4 months ago, the UK government committed £12 million to champion freedom of religion or belief worldwide. And advancing the right to FORB and tackling FORB-related violations has now been confirmed as a priority of Her Majesty's government. Foreign Office Minister Mark Field MP said in Parliament in 2018, "We believe that religious freedom is a bellwether of broader individual freedoms, democratic health and ultimately economic health. For all these reasons, it is a priority for this government to defend and promote the rights of not only Christians but people of all faiths and none, so that they can practice their faith or belief without fear or discrimination." Encouraging words. Yet those suffering religious persecution need action as well as words if their plight is to change and if their rights and freedoms are to be granted and restored. Yes, UK parliaments are increasingly endeavouring to hold our government to account and to act, and it is not only MPs who hold a personal faith in themselves, but encouragingly there is now a wider understanding that if religious freedom goes, other freedoms follow. Today in 2019, barely a Foreign Office questions, these are the questions that are asked every month in our House of Commons when the ministers have to come to the dispatch box and answer questions raised by backbench MPs of all parties. Barely a Foreign Office question goes by each month without the specific issue of religious persecution being raised by MPs. At last week's Foreign Office questions in the House of Commons, there were no less than 15 such questions raised by different members of Parliament. Just a few years ago, it would have been unusual to find one. So expressing concern about religious persecution has now become much more mainstream in the UK Parliament. And the announcement by our Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Jeremy Hunt MP, in December last year of the commissioning by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of an independent review into the persecution of Christians across the globe was a significant confirmation of this. But still, for all this, questions remain. Concerned MPs can debate. We can ask questions in the House of Commons. We can write articles. We can challenge FCO and DFID ministers. We can meet with individuals persecuted to hear their stories firsthand, both here and abroad. Foreign Office ministers can say that they constantly raise cases of persecution with their counterparts abroad. We have a sympathetic Prime Minister. We have a supportive Secretary of State at the Foreign Office. And yet, despite all of this, what difference have we actually made to the lives of those millions who suffer religious persecution across the globe, increasingly, and all too often suffer tragically at the hands of their own governments? With all this increased interest and concern by UK parliamentarians over almost a decade, what have we actually achieved to date? We've created greater awareness, yes, but how now can we create change? That is our challenge. That is our key question for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of these speeches, which should probably be about 10 minutes each long, there should be some time for questions from the floor, points made from the floor, so some involvement there. I'm going to ask actually Damien Thompson to come up next. Damien is a distinguished journalist. He's obviously editor-in-chief of the Catholic Herald, but he's written for the Telegraph and he's a very well-known journalistic face. I'd be very interested to hear what he thinks about why this particular issue very rarely comes up on the BBC or on our broadcast media. Thank you very much, Damien.
Thanks, Peter. I'm old enough to remember the by-election in 1979 in which David Alton, at the age of 29, I think, was elected to Parliament. I'm ashamed to say, as a young Tory, I was dismayed by this. Little did I know that the people of Edgehill had elected the finest parliamentarian in the entire Palace of Westminster, at least in my opinion. There is no living politician for whom I have greater admiration. He's been a friend for 25 years. And we heard why today. If you contrast the passion and the detail, the shocking detail of Lord Alton's address, with the humanitarian platitudes that emanate from what Michael Gove calls the blob, you realise just what a desperate state we're in. And we're in a desperate state, certainly, so far as coverage of the persecution of Christians and other religious minorities in the media is concerned. I had a quick check this morning to see where we were on this subject, and there is plenty of material out there on the internet. It doesn't come from the mainstream media, the MSM that we hear so much about, with a few exceptions. One of them, rather surprisingly, being The Guardian, which does seem to cover the persecution of Christians in reasonable detail, but by and large, it's smaller organisations, and very often organisations that are Christian. So I can give you a list of the stories, but you can find them for yourselves. But I was interested that The Guardian reported that the persecution of Christians in China is the worst it's been for more than a decade, with at least 50 million people expected to experience some form of repression this year. 50 million! Yeah, you heard that right. The crackdown on religion in China is part of a pattern of increasing persecution across Asia over the past 5 years. Open Doors said in its 2019 World Watch List, which ranks 50 countries. Now, that is an important detail there. Open Doors, that's a charity, that's a campaigning organisation. It is the production of reports by Open Doors or Aid to the Church in Need or whoever that generates the stories. Now, this is a good thing in that such terrific work, detailed, systematic work is being done. The data is being collected that DFID is not interested in. That's the good news, but there's a weakness here. Actually, there are two weaknesses. One is, and I probably won't win any friends by saying this, but my experience as a journalist who's been covering religious affairs for 30 years is that not all of these wonderful humanitarian charities have cultivated productive relationships with the media. I found it very, very frustrating. We at the Catholic Herald have found it frustrating because it is within our power to carry a great deal more about this subject, which I was interested, Fiona Bruce was drawing our attention to the growing interest of parliamentarians. I think that actually reflects a growing interest among members of the public. If I tweet something about the persecution of Christians or blog something in Spectator or wherever, it does get a huge response. I don't think it's reflected at institutional level, and that's a very, very important division. But I was interested, encouraged, not entirely surprised to hear that, because I think that does actually reflect genuine indignation among the British people. Quite how they picked up this information, I don't know, because they won't read or hear much about it from the BBC. But I have found it frustrating. I think I'm going to stick my head on the block here and say that I've tried to cultivate, I enormously admire and give money to, that my mother's funeral collection was for aid to the church in need, but I have been somewhat frustrated by their media operation. We could have, the Catholic Herald and Aid to the Church in Need could have achieved a lot working together, but there's, the energy that you find on the front line for those tremendously brave people isn't necessarily reflected in press operations. And I'm not necessarily talking about this country, but there's been a real problem in America. You think, they're doing wonderful things. Why are they telling us in detail? There's one reason why the Catholic Herald has reached out to a priest who is working in this field, extraordinary bravery, and that's Father Benedict Keeley of Nazarene.org, which he founded as recently as 2014, which has made a really big difference to people's awareness of the suffering of Christians. When I'm in America, I talk to people, Father Ben's name comes up again and again, which is why the Catholic Herald, we're getting some copies of the issue delivered here right now. I'm sorry about that rather typical Catholic Herald screw up, but they'll be with you. It's why the Catholic Herald has asked Father Ben to write a monthly column on the persecution of Christians, which will be a resource. Possibly he'll write more often than that, but we need to make our website a resource so that people know exactly what is going on and have some idea of the astonishing variety of countries in which the persecution of Christians happens and is ignored by DFID. So there is a slight problem, I think, with charities not establishing effective relationships with the media. But let's face it, the era of the religion correspondent in Fleet Street is dead. You know, when I was religion correspondent of the Telegraph years ago, there were some heavy hitters in the field. You know, we had Clifford Longley at the Times. So, I mean, there were some very senior journalists working in this field, and now not so many. And if you see religious affairs correspondent under somebody's byline in the media, let me assure you that's probably been tacked on. They said, "Oh, will you take on religion?" "Yeah, I'll take on religion." "Okay, all right, religious affairs correspondent." I've seen it happen. Yeah, social affairs, religion. Yeah, fine. Yeah. And yeah, there's a reporter. I've been in morning conference so many times. There's a report on persecution of Christians. Yeah. All right. What else? What else? I've tried to get articles into. God, I mentioned, publications you would think were very, very sympathetic to this. It's bloody hard. It really is. It's extraordinary indifference to the importance of religion as a subject, even from people who are practicing Christians themselves, as if they're worried that they might embarrass themselves by writing about this unfashionable topic. Which brings us, I think, to one of the reasons that the BBC neglects the persecution of Christians. It's unfashionable. I mean, it's also unfashionable, it should be said, to point out that Muslims are being persecuted in various parts of the world because, all Muslims are jihadists, so no, they can't be being persecuted, doesn't make sense. But really, the really big unfashionable subject is the persecution of Christians. I mean, I was just talking to somebody earlier, trying to get the BBC to pay attention to the demolition of churches in the Catholic churches now, immediately after the Vatican signed this wretched concordat with the Chinese government, which is still going on. Well, the footage is yet to appear on the BBC. So I was dismayed, but not at all surprised to hear what David had to say about DFID and its indifference to this subject. But what do you expect? DFID is part of, again, quote Gove, the blob. It's a world of humanitarian platitudes, virtue signalling, and halo polishing. Now, there are some very important causes, and Lord Alton's been involved in this human trafficking, for example, which is an absolute outrage, which has to be urgently addressed, but actually is, let's face it, is actually quite a fashionable cause. So politicians love to polish their halo. Cardinal Nichols loves to get, he's supposed to be ill, but he went off to Argentina to receive some sort, give him an award for human trafficking. It's great, he talks about it all the time. But persecution of Christians is not so fashionable. It's not so fashionable in Rome either. The Pope talks about it, but not that often, because the Pope prefers fashionable topics, because he's a fashionable Pope, which is why so many of the scandals associated with this pontificate go unreported in the media, which neglects this incredibly important topic of the corruption in Rome, just in the way that it neglects the persecution of Christians. So it doesn't come as an entire surprise to me that the Vatican Secretariat of State is deeply implicated in a concordat with one of the most ferocious and relentless persecutors of Christians in the world, the Chinese government. And what a disgrace to see Chinese spies masquerading as bishops at the Vatican Synod. I was so deeply ashamed, I can't tell you. And now I'm getting too worked up. But the fact is that not enough attention is being paid to this. David Alton, every week, tells the House of Lords, chapter and verse of atrocities which, if we could witness them and if we understood them, would be on the front page of our papers every day, if we understood them, if we cared. But what is perfectly clear is that the blob does not care. DFID does not care. I'm not convinced that the Vatican, which has become increasingly enmeshed with the world of humanitarian virtue signalling, really cares. So what do? We have to force them to care. And one publication that is totally dedicated to forcing them to care about this is the Catholic Herald, which is one reason I beg you, we're not in this for the money, I beg you to support the Catholic Herald in this endeavour, Father Keeley in this endeavour, Lord Alton in this endeavour. I'm preaching to good people. You all know how bad the situation is. Now let's do something about it. Yes, by calling for inquiries. Yes, by the work done. Fiona is an incredibly important witness in the House of Commons, and there are many good MPs who are troubled with this. But now is the time to get tough. Now is the time to force this subject onto the agenda, onto the front pages, and embarrass the hell out of the callous, humanitarian liberals who actually couldn't give a stuff.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Damien, for that impassioned speech. It rang very, very true. I think half of the problem maybe is that the people in the broadcast media, for example, particularly, if not the papers, tend to think we're living in a post-religious age. To them, in their universe, it's a post-religious age. They don't even think it is an issue. And when it does become an issue as well, how far is Christianity in the general pantheon of concerns? I think probably very low. I'd now like to invite Professor Stephen Bullivant. If you'd like to come up, we'd be great to hear your take on it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's obviously a great honour to have been invited to be part of such a distinguished gathering, but particularly a distinguished set of speakers. I Alfred North Whitehead once famously described the history of Western philosophy as a series of footnotes to Plato. I suspect that many of the speakers today will preface their remarks by apologising for theirs being only footnote to Lord Alton. But it's certainly true that much of what I want to say fits in with things already said and I dare say will be said again. I was asked specifically to speak on the issue of what we know about the public perception of and concern for religious and specifically Christian persecution within Western countries, particularly Britain and America, but more broadly. And it's very easy to answer that quite swiftly in that we, in terms of big social attitude surveys, we know very little, precisely because they don't ask these questions. The European Values Survey, the World Values Survey, the British Social Attitude Survey, the General Social Survey in the States, none of these ask questions. And bearing in mind the breadth and detail and specificity of questions that are asked, the sheer fact that this isn't regarded as sufficiently an issue of public interest to even find out how big an issue of public interest it is, itself speaks volumes. The nearest one gets to a large-scale survey question on these topics, I think, is in the European Social Survey, which is asked every 2 years. But this is specifically framed. There's a question, a set of questions about immigration. It talks about there are many reasons that people might wish to come to your country. These include persecution and fear of danger at home, economic reasons, or wanting to move to follow family. And then it gives a series of options as to the respondent's perception of what is a better or worse reason for being allowed to come to the country. And one of the questions asked, one of the options is the extent to which new immigrants come from a Christian background. Now, the framing of the question means that someone who, for example, is aware of Christian persecution, who interprets the question as including that within its remit and thinks that given the extent of Christian persecution across the world, then Christians ought to be regarded as a specifically important category of the sorts of people who one might wish to look upon favorably in these applications. The framing of the question means that that specific question couldn't but be interpreted as actually telling something about ethno-nationalism and Islamophobia and the close-mindedness of populations of specific countries with regard to who should or should not be allowed to immigrate. Just the confused nature of the question that tries to pack in far too many things means that it's not possible to separate a specific concern for the persecution of Christians within this topic. I mean, it strikes me, Damien talks about the unfashionability of Christian persecution, as indeed religious persecution more generally, but given the extent, given the scale, given the severity of Christian persecution, it's, I think, notable how little attention this proportionally receives, given the low-level attention that any of this typically receives in the media. Nevertheless, it's certainly true that issues of LGBT rights, some core celebs around atheist bloggers, humanist bloggers, specific religious or ethnic groups like the Rohingya or the Yazidis. It's not impossible for these stories to get a hearing. But nevertheless, Christian stories tend to suffer in comparison. And I think it's worth asking why that might be. And very briefly, I'd like to offer 3 speculative reasons. Again, we don't have the research. But the first of all is simply that so much of the kinds of persecution, discrimination that we're talking about happens in non-Western, non-Anglophone, non-white countries, which is true of many of the types of persecution that we're talking about. But given that the vast majority of anti-Christian persecution happens in these countries, then they're already going to suffer in terms of the news cycle. An atrocity in America or New Zealand, even if not on white people, will nevertheless gain a great deal more media currency and thus public awareness than a similar or worse atrocity in Central African Republic or the Philippines or anywhere else. It also strikes me that so much of public awareness and concern and campaigning for specific issues leverages domestic concerns. So it's one of the things that strikes me in a lot of the reporting around particular cases of atheist bloggers, for example, in Tunisia and elsewhere, is the extent to which in the past 10, 20, 30 years, we've seen a rise of identity politics among the atheist secularist communities and an internalized sense of discrimination and prejudice, particularly within America, but also within Britain. And so there's a ready constituency of people who feel persecuted, who feel that their group has historically and today been discriminated against within the West. And then it's very easy to tie much more extreme examples of this elsewhere in the world into an overall narrative. And to sort of see what happens in Saudi Arabia, what happens in Tunisia, as sort of a fortiori, just a more extreme case of what typically happens to people of this group. And especially if these groups are viewed with sympathy, with acceptance by the wider public, then it's easier to get a hearing within the press. This is also true, and it's come out very specifically in the past week in the controversy around Brunei. LGBT issues, given the core community in the West, with a very strong sense of historical discrimination and persecution, it then becomes very easy and very fashionable to then gain currency for instances of discrimination that happen elsewhere in the world, and to rally Hollywood actors to the cause because it's a fashionable cause. Christianity, however, it's very difficult to construct these kinds of simple narratives, precisely because Christianity, it seems to me, is very often in the domestic sphere packaged as part of the problem. So if Christianity is viewed as part of the reason why certain groups here are historically discriminated against, persecuted against, receive prejudice, then it's very difficult then to flip this narrative to focus on these groups being persecuted elsewhere in the world. And we see this, I mean, it's very difficult to track in kind of, popular opinion, but there's been studies done on elite cultures in academia and elsewhere in America by the sociologist George Yancey that focuses precisely on this anti-Christian discourse that can be quite, casual. One of his books is called, Too Many Christians, Too Few Lions, which apparently is a sort of a popular meme that gets around. We've seen it in the Home Office letters that I think David Alton mentioned. The ease with which Christianity can be dismissed as outdated, as backward, as patriarchal, oppressive, as insert homophobic, insert discriminatory category here, then makes it very, very, very difficult to garner support and solidarity and concern for Christians being persecuted elsewhere in the world. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That really shed a lot of light on it. I might add, by the way, when it comes to coverage and inviting people along, we did invite on a number of occasions the BBC's senior religious correspondent, Martin Bashir. I don't think we even got a reply, but we did try. I'd like to invite now, please, Mervyn Thomas. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. It's an incredible privilege to be with you today to speak about these issues. My problem was that my brief was to give an overview of persecution and where it's happening in the world, and it's already been done extremely well by David Alton, who he and I have been working sort of side by side for 40 years. And I remember some of the very first board meetings that we had at CSW. David came along as a very young member of Parliament. Of course, I was even much younger at the time. I think I was still at school. But anyway, but it is an amazing privilege to come and speak with some of my heroes like David and Fiona, Caroline Cox and others who know far more about this than me. I've ripped up my speech 4 times this morning, so I just want to look just for a few minutes perhaps at, some of the situations that David talked about this morning are so horrific, are so newsworthy, are so unbelievable, are so sensational. We have to ask ourselves, why aren't they? Why aren't the media covering them? Why isn't this something that's on our front pages every day? And when you look at the situation, when you look at China, for example, and people talk about, there's an official church there, people should go to the official church, and then everything would be okay. Well, do you know, now, even in 3 self-patriotic churches, the official church, if you're one of 5 categories of people, you cannot attend. And one is if you're a member of the military, one is if you are a member, a local or a government official, a Communist Party member, somebody under 18, a minor, or a student. Those 5 groups of people are banned from attending even the official church in China. And those kind of people are so frightened to go to church. Why? Because, of course, everybody carries an identity card. And in this day and age, with an identity card with your photograph on, they have face recognition cameras in all of the churches, in all of the main churches. And so you can't even secretly go to church in the official church in China. And yet, this is unreported. And yet, we hear nothing about it. 1 million Uyghurs, maybe 3 million actually. We are being very conservative when we talk about 1 million. Maybe 3 million Uyghurs. Many towns and villages in Xinjiang province are virtually empty because the Uyghurs have all been taken. They're in the rehabilitation camps. So when you look at the situation in North Korea, which, as David said, Judge Michael Kirby said in his report, the gravity and scale and nature of these human rights violations have no parallel in the world today. But when we hear about North Korea in the media, what do we hear about? Nuclear weapons. We don't hear about human rights abuses. Why is this the case? When you look at the country of Nigeria, and I know Caroline is going to talk about Nigeria this afternoon, but it's a country very close to my heart too. I travel there regularly. I've just come back from a village a few weeks ago that has been the target of many attacks. A village called Asso in southern Kaduna, several attacks on its community. And over 25 people have been killed in several attacks. The first attack came on Easter Day in a church, and they say this is a clash between farmers and herders. What nonsense! There have been clashes between farmers and herders actually for centuries in Nigeria, but what hasn't happened in the past is there haven't been people with AK-47s. Suddenly the Fulani militia are turning up and they're just killing the Christian farmers. Now, I know it's a complex situation, and the Foreign Office will tell us. I was in the debate, I remember Fiona, you spoke about recently, and you know we get all this nonsense about it's not as simple as a religious conflict. Well, I know it's not as simple as that, but should the world be turning a blind eye in any case when thousands of people are being killed and nobody's saying a word about this? It's such an incredible situation. So I want to ask ourselves this morning: why is it? Why is it that the media aren't taking notice? And I, as an NGO, I'm going to take issue with what Damien was saying, because I think we try very, very, very hard to get the media to take notice of what we say. We send at CSW, we send out probably up to a dozen press releases.
You're very good at it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, you should have said that from up here. We send out up to a dozen press releases every week on these situations, and very often the Christian press will pick it up, but the secular media don't pick it up time after time. Just cast your mind back a few years ago to. You remember Charlie Hebdo? We all remember Charlie Hebdo because it was on the front pages of our newspapers. It was the first item on the news for night after night after night. A dozen or so journalists killed in France. Terrible thing. But you know, in the same week, 200 Christians were slaughtered in northern Nigeria. And we put out a press release about it, and nobody said a word. Nothing was said. Why is that the case? And you know, I listened to what Fiona said this morning, and I agree wholeheartedly, because I believe, and I've been doing this for 40 years, like David, I think that there has never been a time that I can remember where there's more a political awareness of religious freedom violations and the problems surrounding religious freedom. I think when you look, not just in our parliament, where most weeks there are questions, there are debates on religious persecution. There are always, as Fiona said, about all those questions, at Foreign Office questions. Week after week, those questions. We've got the APPG. We've now got the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief. There is so much awareness at a political level. This time, last summer, Secretary of State Pompeo called an international ministerial where 80 foreign ministers from around the world went to Washington. I was there. I'm going to a second one this year. What did they talk about? Advancing international religious freedom. So there's more awareness at a political level, I believe, than there has been for many, many years, or since I've been doing this. But I was asked the question on because it's also CSW's 40th anniversary this year. And I was doing a radio interview, and they said to me, so tell us the countries where you've seen a difference in the last 40 years. And I struggled. Of course, we started off, as David said, we started off in Eastern Europe, and that is largely free today, although there are signs that some of that's going backwards now too. But apart from that, we may have seen some change in countries, but then it's gone the other way. Even China, 10 years ago, we thought things were improving. And now it's gone back, and probably is the worst situation for religious minorities in China since the Cultural Revolution, which is unbelievable. So what's gone wrong? We have all this political awareness. I speak to conferences like this all the time, and it's all the same people. We all know this. We all know it. So why isn't there change out there? Fiona's question is so right. We've got this awareness. We now have to change this. And I hope this conference, one of the things that we'll take out of it, I'm so pleased that we've got the three groups of people here, NGOs, parliamentarians, and the media, because we have to be a team. We have to work in this together. And I believe the key to it, I sincerely believe that the key to seeing a change is the media. Because we have the NGOs with the information, we have the parliamentarians who are standing up and passionately speaking about this, but we have a largely silent media. And so I hope that today we'll be able to say, how can we, what is it we have to do to ensure that these sensational stories, these situations which are just unbelievable, how do we make sure that they get on the front pages? Because I believe that the moment we can see these stories in the headlines is the moment that we'll begin to see awareness changing into action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marvin. We've got about 10 minutes just for some points from the audience. If anyone has got any questions, couldn't you just say who you are, please, and also direct your question, please, to the panel. So I have one there and one there. This gentleman here first, please. Right. Well, no, you can give it to them. Just give it to them.
So David Campanale, I work for BBC World News, but I'm here on a day off and not speaking for the corporation. A couple of points. I mark this is 30 years of covering religious liberty issues for the BBC. Needless to say, David Alton appeared in the first news report from Western Ukraine in the end of 1989. A couple of points. I think Mervyn is right to say that the media plays a significant part of the answer to this. However, he's wrong to say that you've got all the information, because you don't. And the point I wish to make is that the 24-hour news cycle relies on pictures. So it's wonderful to have the 12 news releases, and I read all of them. But without the pictures, you can't tell the story. And even with the pictures, the BBC will not just run anything. It needs to be confident that the pictures show and what they purport to show. And that goes through a careful process of verification. Now, of course, the challenge is that with government imposed cuts to the BBC over the last decade, we've lost hundreds and hundreds of journalistic posts. You will hear my bosses say that we need to do fewer stories better. And without pictures and doing fewer stories better, it's very, very hard to make a priority of journalistic attention on the process of verification.
So, do you want them to answer that? Because we've got to get some more people in as well.
Yeah, and the second point is, just quickly in that case, is a broader point. At the Reform Club, I'd love to, and in front of this audience, I'd love to quote a bit of Karl Marx, who said that in every epoch, the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. And we have leaders in our country, all the way up to the very top, who have no confidence in the paradigm of Christianity as being the prevailing one, which underpins Western civilization. So I actually think the reluctance to cover this is a little bit to do with a degree of self-loathing. We want to deny the fact that Christianity underpins Western free institutions. And my last point is to pay credit to the Hungarians and our Polish friends in getting that subject back on the international agenda.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody got any questions as opposed to points that they'd like to put to the panel? This is gentleman at the back there. Was it? Yeah.
My name is Guy Sainty. I don't represent anybody particularly, but anyway, I was going to ask, when Lord Alton spoke, he spoke about the origins of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the leadership given by Mrs. Roosevelt at that time. And at that time, we could all have expected the United States to be fairly united on the subject of the rights of religious minorities and the rights and the freedom of speech under the First Amendment of the Constitution. What we see today, however, is a president on the one hand who uses virulent anti-Muslim rhetoric, and on the Democratic Party side, we see a party whose policies are in many cases directed almost directly against Christian groups. Just to give you a very recent example, in California, California has just passed a law requiring churches to provide health insurance for medical procedures that directly contravene Catholic teachings. Now, because of this, Christianity has almost become something that's politicized in America, so we can no longer look to American leadership. Does anybody on the panel think there's any way this can change, or is it going to get worse in the future?
A quick comment from each of you.
Well, I think Guy, I think I'm.
It's okay.
By the way, I've been tapping on my phone because I'm live tweeting this event, not because I'm being rude and talking to mates, but it's just a way of getting the message out there. And how useful these things are, because actually while we were speaking, Guy earlier sent me a link about the atrocities committed against Christians in France. I think I take issue a little bit with what he says about America. Actually, this administration is, I mean, we all know what Trump's faults are, but it does, I think, take the persecution of Christians certainly far more seriously than a Hillary Clinton administration would have. And it's, you know, Sam Brownback is a very dynamic figure working in this area. On the subject of the BBC, yes, well, David Campanella is a great exception to. Well, I find the problem with the BBC, yes, there's a problem with pictures, but there's also a problem with the institutional culture of the BBC, which is the same as the institutional culture of the government. Whether it be a Labour or a Tory government, it's the institutional culture of the liberal establishment. And there's a genuine and absolutely genuine lack of interest in this subject in the BBC. They're not kidding when they say they're not interested.
Has anybody got anything you'd like on the panel to add, just briefly to that? We'll get one more question in. Then
What, on the US or on anything?
on the gentleman's question or on the BBC?
Yeah, no, on David's points about pictures, I think that's a good point. I think one of the problems is that some of the pictures, or the pictures that we've got, you would not print. I've got pictures on my phone that were sent to me last night of northern Nigeria, and body after body with machetes and cut off heads, and they're the kind of pictures that would shock the world, but they're not in decent taste. And I think one of the problems with pictures, and I do accept what you say, is that getting the kind of pictures that are not boring or to the other extreme is actually rather difficult. But I accept the general point, and with regard to verification, I can tell you, David, without any doubt, anything that CSW puts out, we have three separate sources before we'll put anything out. You can guarantee, you can stake your life virtually on the stuff that we put out. We're very, very careful about that, and I think most news organisations know that, but it's a reputation we've built up over many years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time for one more point, if anyone would like to ask. Anything? No, great. I think that the point that you made, BBC Man, I think the idea... the idea that somehow religion, Christianity is, if you like, in a way, the religion of the oppressor, or almost. That's the old idea, isn't it, in the liberal pantheon, in a way, that it sort of conjures up therefore we shouldn't worry so much about it, maybe. Just one thing to say before we break. Damien, your magazine has arrived.
Yes.
So here's the Catholic Herald, which in fact I think carries John O'Sullivan's great article from...
It is, and it's had, John's piece has had the most tremendous take-up around the world of any cover story we've carried for years, I think.
Great.
So please read it. It's a very, very fine.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Could you just thank our panel? Thank you very much. Thank you.